So it turns out Jason Statham's latest movie, The Beekeeper, is a thinly veiled allegory about wanting to unalive Hunter Biden. But is it actually any good? Just to be clear, this video isn't political. I don't care if you're a libertarian or a librarian, but I do care about this movie because it is quite literally one of the most baffling films I've ever seen. Well, technically it's 3 separate films in a trench coat, and I have thoughts on all of them. Now, I firmly believe you should judge a movie based on what it's trying to accomplish, and the first thing that Beekeeper wants to be is a political hit piece. David Ayer, the director, claims that this isn't specifically about Hunter Biden. Josh Hutcherson just happens to be the president's son who does drugs and gets caught up in a computer-based crime scandal. Even if we choose to believe the director, the film is still obviously focused on critiquing the corrupt practices that run rampant in government. The thesis of the film is basically that the weakest in our society get taken advantage of, while the powerful are protected and never held accountable. It's a pretty simple idea that should be easy to explore, which is why the execution in the actual film baffles me. For context, David Ayer is a relatively inconsistent filmmaker. For every great film he writes or directs like Training Day or End of Watch, there's also a movie like Bright or Suicide Squad.
This is Katana! She's got my back! Her sword traps the souls of its victims.
A film like Fury shows how well he explores themes of humanity, violence, and desperation, but simultaneously, I think he's kind of inept when it comes to political messaging.
Fairy lives don't matter today.
Like I mentioned, The Beekeeper is about the powerful being protected at the expense of the most vulnerable members of society. But how does it introduce this idea? Well, Jason Statham's neighbor, played by Felicia Rashad, gets randomly targeted by a group of computer scammers. When they gain access to her accounts and steal her life savings, the character just immediately shoots herself. Rather than calling the police to report the fraud or reaching out to her daughter, who later becomes a major part of this movie, she just immediately offs herself. Even though this was in the trailer, I legitimately laughed out loud in the theater when this happened because it was so out of left field. The character didn't show any signs of depression or hopelessness up until this point, so her actions feel like a cheap way to motivate Jason Statham rather than being a powerful turning point. Imagine if instead we see her take the issue to court. They could show through montage that it's a long, drawn-out process, and have it end with them not helping her, saying it's her own fault. This would clearly communicate the idea of the system being broken and make the suicide more understandable. It wouldn't add more than 3 minutes to the runtime, but it would be infinitely better at motivating the protagonist both personally and thematically. Speaking of which, the protagonist isn't really a character in this movie. Jason Statham is a retired beekeeper, which is this universe's version of a John Wick style assassin, but we never learn why he retired, and once he decides to get revenge for the death of his neighbor, he just goes on an uninterrupted killing spree for the rest of the movie. When we're not watching poorly directed action scenes, which I'll talk about in a bit, Agent Parker, Mrs. Parker's daughter, takes over as the main character. She's the one who researches beekeepers and scam artists, and basically dumps awkward exposition on the audience for minutes at a time. Now, what's frustrating is how much potential they wasted with this character. She's an FBI agent, which means she's directly linked to the system that this movie thinks is so corrupt, but they barely explore this. The quote-unquote big reveal of this movie is that the villain is the president's son, and he helped finance her campaign with the money he stole. But when Agent Parker realizes this, nothing actually changes in the story. It seemed like they were setting it up so the bosses at the FBI and CIA would try to have her killed in order to cover this up, which could have led to an awesome third act in which she has to team up with Jason Statham. Instead, she just continues hunting down Jason Statham with the full support of the US government. The closest thing she has to growing as a character is letting Jason Statham get away at the end of the movie, but by this point, he had already shot the big villain. Her actions are essentially meaningless, and she still appears to be content acting as a cog in a corrupt machine. Would it really have been that hard to show a scene or two where the character questions if she's doing the right thing? Or even if she's okay working for the government, we could see her hot on the heels of Jason Statham, only to have her plans ruined thanks to bureaucracy or the incompetence of those in command. To be fair though, even the movie doesn't know what it wants to say. It's supposedly critiquing the lack of accountability in government, but also goes out of its way to show politicians and bureaucrats doing the right thing. Rather than covering up what Agent Parker found out about the villain's finances, is, her boss directly confronts the president with these facts. And when the president learns how corrupt her son is, she immediately decides to inform the public, regardless of what it might do to her reputation. This is why I say the political messaging is so inept. The movie provides evidence that directly refutes its own thesis. And before you say, Dylan, you're thinking about this too much, it's not trying to say anything. Multiple characters throughout the film give monologues about correcting the system when it becomes broken or corrupt.
I protect the hive. When the system is out of balance, I correct it.
We have laws for these things.
Until they fail, then you have me.
So I don't think it's all that much to ask that professional filmmakers actually show examples of this in the movie. And if David Ayer wants to specifically critique only computer scams, maybe don't make the villain a thinly veiled allegory for Hunter Biden. But the story and messaging is just superfluous, right? It's just an excuse to get to the action scenes. So are the action scenes any good? Well, remember when the Bourne trilogy came out and Hollywood became obsessed with close-up shaky cam fight scenes? And maybe you even remember that moviegoers universally said, hey, cut that out, I can't see what the heck is happening. Well, even if Pepperidge Farm remembers, David Ayer clearly doesn't. The whole movie consists of quick cuts between blurry shots of Jason Statham waving his hands around and then someone falling down. There's no visceral impact because everything feels so disjointed. The audience knows that what's happening on screen isn't real, but the movie doesn't even try to sell the illusion. It's like if a magician said, watch me pull a rabbit out of this hat, then walked out of the room and came back in with a stuffed rabbit and a different hat. Ayer is an experienced filmmaker, but the way these fight scenes are filmed throughout the entire movie makes it feel like a low-budget feature from a first-time director.
That's not good.
No, it's not.
I get that not every action movie can be as well made as the John Wick films, but if the main appeal of your movie is the action, then that action should at least be high quality, and you shouldn't try to cover it up by cutting constantly from one blurry shot to the next. It sort of makes sense in the second big action sequence where Statham sneaks around his shed, quietly eliminating thugs like it's a scary movie. But the cinematic language this film utilizes is otherwise at odds with what it is trying to portray. Honestly though, the action sequences would still be incredibly generic even if they were filmed better. The sequences are loud and punchy, but utterly devoid of any creativity. Half the time it's just Jason Statham punching some generic henchman in a hallway with bisexual lighting. But even when they add something interesting to the mix, like, say, a truck-mounted minigun, it gets fired one time before it gets removed from the equation. To bring up John Wick again, part of what makes those films so great is how they basically treat every action sequence like a level in a video game. In good game design, you introduce a mechanic, establish an objective, complicate the mechanic as you get closer to the objective, and then reward the player when they reach the objective.
This was a triumph.
That's why the stair sequence in John Wick Chapter 4 works so well. The objective is to reach the top, the mechanic is to fight uphill with the help of Donnie Yen, the complication is getting knocked down the steps, and the reward is John making it to the duel on time. By contrast, the fights in the Beekeeper rarely have more than one or two of these elements. The mechanic is almost always punching or kicking, the objective is almost always to punch or kick everyone in this room, and the lack of significant complications means that there isn't a sense of reward when Statham has punched or kicked his way through the entire cast of this movie. Any action movie worth its salt needs to have action sequences that are either clever or well executed. Ideally, you have both, but Beekeeper has neither. Now, the last movie in this trench coat is the one I'm most perplexed by. It's obvious to me that the Beekeeper wants to be a B movie. Not the B movie, which is also a B movie about bees, but a B movie in the sense that it's paying homage to schlocky action flicks that don't take themselves too seriously. There's a reason they cast Jason Statham as the lead. Aside from his role in the 2006 crime epic Pink Panther, Jason Statham appears almost exclusively in dumb but fun action movies, or at least films that want to be fun, and that's my biggest problem with The Beekeeper. It doesn't feel like the filmmakers had fun making this movie. 20% of the dialogue is bee-based.
I'm a beekeeper. I protect the hive.
And it legitimately seems that the writer and director both expect you to take it seriously. Speaking of the writer, I think looking at his portfolio can help explain why a bad movie like Beekeeper isn't a good bad movie like most other Jason Statham flicks. Kurt Wimmer, who wrote the screenplay, has a long list of credits working on schlocky action flicks similar to this one. Most notably though, he wrote the 2015 remake of Point Break, which not only explains why the ending of Beekeeper is a cheap copy of this scene, but also shows that Wimmer has a habit of taking his work too seriously.
Bodhi, do you have any idea how many people you've killed? How many laws you've broken?
The only law that matters is gravity.
Stop!
The original Point Break is as cheesy as it is epic. Its distinctly 90s tone makes it an unabashedly fun watch, but the 2015 remake strips the story of any of its charm. It takes the plot of a movie that worked, but doesn't understand the nuances that made it such a classic action movie. And this same joylessness can be felt throughout the entire movie. Each moment in Beekeeper feels obligatory, like the whole team just wants to get it over with. And it's really a shame because there's an alternate universe where Beekeeper is a brilliant cult classic. With just a few changes, this film could have been a fun, humorous, and action-packed B-movie that actually makes meaningful commentary about the world we live in. But instead, we just got a film that lacks any reason to exist. I understand that not every movie can be a masterpiece, but if you're gonna spend millions of dollars on a movie, why not take the time to make it better than the bare minimum? Subscribe for more and click here to see how the screenplay saved John Wick. I'm Dylan, and this has been The Writer's Block.